a modern remake of an icon, the 35mm Steel Rim Reissue. Previously, we took a look at the history, the ergonomics, the good things and the strange flaws about this lens, and I ran you through my confusing experience of acquiring one. Well, since then, I've been using this lens a lot, and today we're going to focus on the pictures made with this lens. And most importantly, we're going to take a look at how it stacks up in direct comparison to my favorite lens, the lens that I use for almost everything, and the very first video I made here on YouTube, the vintage pre-aspherical Summilux. We're going to see comparison pictures in bright light, low light, indoors, outdoors, black and white, and color, and at the end, we're going to take on the question that almost scares me. Can the reissue replace my vintage piece? Let's jump right in. Unless otherwise indicated, all the pictures that you're about to see were made with the 35mm Steel Rim Reissue, developed at home on a rotary processor. Before getting this lens, I actually had two different people who I know personally tell me not to waste my time with it. Both of them knew that I loved my vintage piece. One was really unimpressed with the build quality of the reissue, and the other, the lack of character of the pictures that it made. Well, despite that, I still went ahead and got one just to form a first-hand experiential opinion for myself. Before I tell you my thoughts on the reissue, today I wanted to do something a bit more interesting. I'm first going to try to help you start building that preliminary opinion of the differences between these two lenses for yourself. Without telling you which is which, I'll show you a sequence of pictures made on each lens. And as you see them side by side, make notes of your thoughts. If you can, pause the video and write down your observations somewhere, all the small differences that you might notice, and most importantly, which you might prefer and why. And after that, I'll share with you all my thoughts as well, and with your initial notes, we'll be able to see how those things fit together. Now, you might already have some preconceptions on the reissue versus the vintage piece, but for now, try to put that aside and view this with as much of a blank slate as possible. And it's really important to know that for the coming pictures, lens A will always be A and B will always be B, so I won't trick you by swapping them between each other. So are you ready? Let's go. For all the pictures that you just saw, A was the reissue, while B was the vintage piece. So I've been using the reissue for a few months now, and it's been a really insightful experience. You see, sometimes a good way to form a deep opinion about something isn't just to explore the science of it like we just did, doing A/B testing, trying to logically wrap our heads around it. Now that is helpful to form a general rough opinion about something, but in order to go deeper, sometimes you have to just really actually use it over and over again, day in and day out, until it becomes bland. Your new normal, your new status quo. And when you're so familiar with something, the moment anything deviates away from it, even by just a bit, you'll instinctively, subconsciously already know. If you've gotten so used to that same cup of coffee that you drink every single day, if one day someone diluted it down, you don't need an A/B comparison to tell you, hey, this is slightly watery. And for the longest time, my status quo was the vintage pre-aspherical Summilux. So when I switched to the reissue, I immediately saw all the differences. Now I've been thinking about the best way to describe the vintage piece, and so far the best word that I could come up with is fragility. Especially wide open and to a certain degree stopped down, the vintage pre-aspherical Summilux always has this sense of breaking apart, of vulnerability, of fragility. It's like an old piece of paper that is just about to fall apart, but it somehow holds together, and that's just beautiful. And so the biggest difference that I immediately noticed when I switched to the reissue is that it doesn't have that same sense of fragility and vulnerability. But wait, does that mean the reissue has lost all its charm, all its character? Well, not quite. It's more nuanced than that, but to really get to the bottom of this, we must first explore the specific components that makes the vintage pre-aspherical Summilux unique. What exactly are the fundamental things about this lens that gives it that sense of character? Are there any specific things we can point to? When thinking about this, I realized that there were actually 5 core attributes about this lens that really stood out to me that I've grown really fond of. 5 essential components that makes it unique compared to every other lens. And it's not just these things in isolation, but how they come together, how they synergize, how they play off each other, that creates the distinct sense of charm, which I really, really love. And those 5 things are aberrations, blur, glow, contrast, and flare. Now, we're not going to get super technical about these things because the science behind them can get really dry, but we will unpack each of them because doing so will help us wrap our heads around what actually makes the vintage piece feel vintage. And by doing that, we'll be able to better answer the question of, has the reissue indeed lost that magic? First off, aberrations. Now, technically, an aberration just means something that deviates from the norm. So things like vignetting, flare, those are all technically aberrations as well. But for the sake of today's video, instead of calling this coma or tangential and sagittal astigmatism, we'll just call it aberrations. And all that refers to is the beautiful, swirly, circular thing that happens to the highlights, especially in the corners of the frame. You will see this a lot in other vintage lenses as well, but to me, this is very much at the heart of the look of the vintage pre-aspherical Summilux. Next up, we have background blur. Not the quantity of blur, like how blur the background gets, but more specifically, the quality of that blur. Some really modern lenses renders out of focus areas in a flat, really even kind of way, like iPhone portrait mode, while others render it in a more haptic, chaotic way. And this is commonly referred to as smooth or busy background blur, and that is kind of what we're talking about here. How the background blur is presented. And broadly speaking, modern lenses are smoother, while vintage lenses are a bit more chaotic. When it comes to the character of the blur of the vintage piece, it's definitely on the busier side of things, but to me, that chaos is beautiful and I really love its look. And similar to aberrations, the quality of the blur that this lens has is very much at the heart of its look. For example, the Voigtlander f1.4 Nocturne. A really similar lens, similar size, similar specs, but the Voigtlander has a tremendously different quality to its background blur, and that immediately makes it feel like a very, very different lens. Then we have glow. This is the way the highlights bloom, the way the edges of things, especially bright things, soften up due to a transition in tones rather than a hard drop-off. It creates an effect almost like something is glowing because it doesn't have that hard edge. And this glow is something that modern lenses try to eliminate, but the pre-aspherical Summilux has it in spades. Next is the most straightforward one, overall contrast. Vintage lenses generally have a lower sense of contrast, and the pre-aspherical Summilux is a lower contrast lens. It's something that I've grown to love because that means shadows oftentimes have more texture, especially when paired with high contrast black and white film. It's just a beautiful thing. And finally, flare. We all know this, the beautiful light that comes into a picture that gives it that slightly washed out quality. These are the 5 core things that the pre-aspherical Summilux does in a unique way. But it's also really important to note that while these things are quantifiable, they are measurable, we can look at them and say this lens objectively has more glow than the other. There is also the unquantifiable side of things, the style, the manner in which each aspect synergizes with and plays off each other, the many other qualitative things about a lens that results in a picture feeling a certain way. There is just so much more to it, but for the sake of this video, these are the 5 main things we will focus on, just so that we have a tangible point of reference. Now, if you take a look at these 5 things, you'll soon realize that all that vintage charm, that character, they are all actually a result of imperfections, technical and optical imperfections, and it's fascinating that what makes something feel modern is the ironing out, the polishing away of those imperfections. And I've always found that really fascinating, that in the pursuit of technical excellence, sometimes things can get lost. But so today, let's see if the reissue has indeed lost anything. First off, Aberrations. The corners of the reissue does have that same swirly circular thing as the vintage piece. So when it comes to aberrations, that characteristic is still there. With background blur, to my eyes, it's rendered in very much the same way as well, both slightly chaotic and beautiful. The out of focus areas of the reissue definitely looks like a vintage lens to me, so far looking pretty similar. Then we have glow. Here's where things begin looking really different. The vintage piece has much more highlight bloom, while the reissue has a much harder edge around objects. This glow is oftentimes viewed as softness, so to some people, they might perceive the new one as being sharper because of that clearer transition around objects. So the amount of glow is the first significant difference we're seeing between these two lenses, the vintage piece having much more glow. Next, we have contrast, and again, we're seeing a big difference. The reissue definitely has much more contrast throughout the aperture range, but it's really obvious wide open. The highlights are generally more lifted, but you really see this in the shadows. The black regions go much deeper, while the vintage piece has much more shadow information and texture. Overall, the vintage one has significantly lower contrast. So just like glow, when it comes to contrast, the new one does take one step towards feeling more like a modern lens. Now finally, to me the biggest difference between them, and that is flare. The vintage piece is much more prone to flaring, especially wide open. You'll see a much more washed out picture. With the new one, flare is much more under control, and you'll notice this in particular when you take a look at night pictures with street lamps. So when it comes to flare, the reissue again takes one step in the direction of being a more modern lens. So out of those 5 things, the reissue only keeps true to 2 of them. So is all the character gone? Now you might think so, but it really depends on what you personally attribute to that vintage lens feel. If it's primarily flare, a more faded, washed out, lower contrast picture with a ton of glow, if those things are the main things that you associate with character, then yes, much of that is lost with the reissue. The way I see it, when I look at the pictures made with the reissue, I still see pictures made by a vintage lens. Now some parts of it are one step in the direction towards the look, towards the feel of a more modern lens. But despite having less glow, more contrast, at its core, the essence of the visual signature of the pre-aspherical Summilux, which I love so much, when I see pictures made with the new lens, that essence is still very much there, but it's like tightened up, it's polished off. Well, so far we've only seen pictures in black and white. But what about color? Well, let's take a look at them right now. Similarly, write down your notes and we'll get to them in just a bit. So what difference did you notice between these 2 lenses on color film? Which did you prefer? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comment section below. And for this comparison, you may have guessed it, A again was the reissue, while B was the vintage lens. So now moving on to the harder question, which is for you? Well, first, it's really important to frame the reissue properly. When most people hear steel rim reissue, they think that, oh man, I'm getting a vintage lens at a fraction of the price. That's not what this lens is. It's not a vintage lens. Because no brand new lens can ever really truly recreate what a 60-year-old object actually feels like. Now, I'm really into guitars, and in the guitar world, there are so many vintage remakes. But if you have actually played a real 1960s Gibson, there's just no recreating the effect of time, the way it exerts itself on an object. And say if you have used a Leica M2 or an M3, and if you compare that to a brand new MA, you'll know that it's just completely different. It's a different thing. So don't buy the reissue thinking that you're getting a vintage lens, because it just isn't. But it also doesn't mean that it's any worse. It just depends on which flavor you prefer. I would describe the flavor of the vintage piece as being looser, more fragile, more raw. Pictures fall apart more, while the reissue is more held together, more robust, more polished. And in a technical sense, it does perform optically better. And for you to answer that question, having seen the pictures in this video, if the reissue feels too cold, too polished off, too modern, and especially if you prefer a more fragile feeling lens, then for sure get the vintage piece. But on the other hand, I do have a friend who owned the vintage pre-aspherical Summilux for a while and found it just too much. Uncontrollable, flare wide open, too little contrast, too much flavor. If that's you, then the reissue fixes those specific things, and it might be exactly what you're looking for. And that brings me to the most difficult question of this video. Does the new one replace my vintage lens? Well, sadly, the answer is no, but not for the reasons you might think. In terms of how it physically feels to use in person, the experience of shooting it, I've gotten used to the infinity lock, so no issues there, and I've been really enjoying it physically. And in terms of its picture making, can I imagine myself using the new piece for the next 5-10 years? Would I be happy with the pictures? Well, actually, yes. Definitely yes. I've actually been really happy with the pictures made with this lens. It's definitely missing that extra something in terms of flavor, but it still has that core DNA to me. And it's like a trade-off, right? A trade-off between character and consistency, between fragility and dependability. And for most things, I'm really happy to make that trade. You see, even when using my vintage piece, most of the time, I don't always want so much overt character. 90% of the time, I shoot it at f2 because the flavor of it wide open is just so strong. It's not something I want on everything. So in my mind, I don't actually see the vintage pre-aspherical Summilux as an f1.4 lens, but an f2 lens which has a built-in extra character button on it. But that button is something that I only use when the picture calls for it. With the reissue on the other hand, I've been able to use it much more comfortably at f1.4 in a much larger variety of situations, precisely because it has less flavor. So for a large majority of the pictures that I make, I'm really happy with the reissue. But then comes that one picture out of 100, when all the imperfections of the vintage piece, they synergize together to produce something that just feels special. And that special magic sauce, that unquantifiable quality, that is lost with the reissue. And so even if I do want the reissue most of the time, it can't ever fully replace my vintage piece. And knowing myself, if I sold that, I'm definitely going to deeply regret it. So here I am, catch-22. I guess I'll just be holding on to them both. Thanks, Leica. Just thanks. If you want to see more pictures made with these two lenses, check out the earlier videos I did on them. If you enjoyed yourself today, subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.